How's it going, guys? It's Al. I'm back at you one more time for another video right here on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and click the bell so that you get notifications anytime that I post a new video, which is going to be happening all NFL season long and into NBA season. Today, I have a guest on the show. I've got the great Scott Barrett DFB on Twitter. If you don't follow him, please do so. Correct that mistake if you could. We're going to talk about all the things that you need to get the most out of a PFF subscription for fantasy. A lot of times I get asked in the YouTube comments, on our stream, on Twitter, what do I use for research? And for me, one of the key points of my research is looking through PFF and using its tools to identify the weakest spots that I can attack that week in daily fantasy, to identify some sleepers, some guys whose snap counts are rising as opposed to falling, some guys who are good rather than lucky, right? I don't want somebody who just kind of made the most of a very small snap count or a very small target count. I want to get guys who actually have talent, and PFF really helps me do that. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on, Al.
Not a problem. Before we started this video, if you were watching a Twitch stream, I gave you guys an article. I will put that in the comment section down below in the description of the video. The first thing that we're going to start with, there's a bunch of articles on PFF that we can use every week. Scott, why don't you take us through those articles? And those are all paywalled articles, whether you have a PFF Edge or whether you have a PFF Elite sub. These are all paywalled articles that you can use. So key takeaways from the week, waiver wire ads if you're playing season long.
Yeah, so you can read my actual opportunity report. It's pretty much the main stat I use for Draftkings and FanDuel, DFS. Can't recommend that enough, but of course I'm biased. You can read snaps, pace, and stats, which is a Pat Thorman article. You want to know in DFS which games have the highest likelihood of shooting over, being high-paced in nature. He's going to tell you what those games are going to be. You can read Jeff Ratcliffe's wide receiver versus cornerback matchup. I know you, like me, we both like to go cheap at the quarterback position on DraftKings. So you can read our QB streamers article. And really, those are just 4 or 5 of 30 various articles you can get with either an Elite or an Edge subscription.
Yeah, a lot of people like to pick their quarterbacks late in fantasy drafts, as they probably should, considering how narrow the band of scoring is at quarterbacks, and you find guys on your waiver wire. So if you're looking at a season-long article that's detailing QB streamers, which is basically looking at guys that are on the waiver wire that you could pick up and use that week in your season-long leagues, imagine those guys are waiver wired players. They're probably super cheap in daily fantasy for that week as well. So don't ignore all the season-long information that's out there just to focus on a DFS-centric article. Find the articles, because before there was DFS-centric stuff, guys like me were playing a long time ago, had to find articles that were for season long that we could use for daily fantasy, and QB streamers articles are definitely one of those. Moving on to the player grades and snap counts, right? So right now these matchups are set up as it looks on this screen for the grades and matchups page for preseason. This is today's slate. It is October the 24th. Or sorry, August the 24th when we're recording this. So there's 3 preseason games on this slate. You can kind of choose your own matchup if you want. I'm just going to click on Patriots and Panthers, and if you want to walk us through this, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so let's look at the Patriots and Panthers matchup. That's tonight. That's preseason. So if we click on that, it'll show us, the various matchups that might be relevant for DFS. It shows us the grades of the different players. Like we can see that the Patriots defensive line matches up really well against Carolina's offensive line, especially on Cam Newton's blind side. Claiborne might cause some trouble for Cam Newton this game. I mean, Cam's probably only going to play a handful of snaps.
Right.
We could also notice that Devin Funchess has a tough matchup against Gilmore. He's highly graded, whereas Smith has a softer matchup against Rowe, who's also might be playing a little out of position. I know he played a lot of slot corner last year. But if we go back, so if you see on the right, all teams, you can do that, and you can just look at the team for their offense and defense grades and players and starters. if you want to go back and you can choose a matchup, you can make a custom matchup. So if you want to look at week 1, you can
let's do a week 1
custom matchup. All right.
Let's do. So we've got Steelers at the Browns is the first game that pops into my head, right? So Steelers at Browns, go. So here's a week 1 matchup with all the PFF grades embedded into it.
Right. So you'll see, Landry and Gordon have, arguably tough matchups. So this is a preset for 2 tight ends, which is, base offense for Cleveland versus the base defense for Pittsburgh. But if we want to look at how their offense looks with 3 receivers on the field, you just go up, you click on that left arrow until you get to 3 receivers. And now we see Landry in the slot up against Hilton, who was one of our top 10 highest rated cornerbacks last year. He's highly effective in the slot. We can look at
Pittsburgh was exceptionally tough last year against tight ends, and Njoku is somebody who's getting a lot of buzz in the preseason, rightfully so. I expect this kid to bust out this year over the course of the year, but week 1 might be a tough matchup for him, but his snap count may overrule that. So you talked about the guys that a tight end's going to match up with only matches up 20-something% of the time.
Yeah,
so it's more
not
a team
like
defensive scheme thing.
Yeah, it's not like with a slot cornerback who typically, a slot wide receiver who typically faces off against the slot cornerback for 60% of the game.
Mm-hmm.
For tight ends, it's a lot less against one guy.
Okay. I mean, so that's super solid, and it's very straightforward, right? So you just flip around. It's what do they run the most percent of the time? So Detroit is a team that stands out to me. The last couple of years, they've run 3 wide receiver 80 plus 84% of the time, something like that. So if you're going to look at the Lions matchup, always set it to 3 wide receiver, and you'll see how they're going to match up against slot corners, how they're going to match up on the outside, where the advantages are and where they're not. You can also, as Scott pointed out, look at a defensive line versus offensive line matchup, which is something that is very important to me, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Projections and rankings, they obviously have those on site. Every site has them. PFF has done a great job with their projections and their site rankings for years. Obviously, they also do a composite where, they'll have every one of their experts rank the quarterbacks 1 through 30 on the week. So you get kind of which expert is looking at who where. But moving on to the stats thing, this is where I get the most out of it. Okay, again, I want data. And PFF has a ton of data and different ways that you can sort through it. So looking at the historical fantasy stats, because obviously we have no stats from 2017 yet, you can sort by any position you want. So let's say wide receivers, okay? And then for me, we can set this to guys that played over 50% of the snaps, right? And then we can look at what weeks. So let's say let's say we get to week 8 during the regular season. And it's going to say, well, these guys are leading the league in targets, and these guys are leading the league in red zone targets, or points per opportunity. That's this PPO, whether it's PPR or standard under those columns. But let's say I want to say, all right, I want to eliminate weeks 1 through 4. Let's say we're in week 9. And I just want to see the past month. Who's leading the league in targets over that period of time, and all of a sudden I can easily sort by that, looking at who led the league in targets. Antonio Brown. Jarvis Landry was somebody we knew was going to lead in targets, but Adam Thielen at that point last year really stood out as somebody that how is he doing as well as he's doing? Well, and he wasn't scoring touchdowns, but he was getting a ton of looks. So the ability to sort by position, snap count, see how things are trending over time. You can even break this down to looking at a specific team. So let's say, since I just brought up Thielen, where's Minnesota? Look at all their wide receivers that played over that period of time, right? Same idea. Who led them in targets over that period of time? It was pretty big, right? Diggs only played 2 games. Treadwell played 3. To me, this is an invaluable tool for me to kind of research things and find trends in teams that may not show up if you're just looking at the overall season. Redmus123, thank you for the new sub, man. So their fantasy stats and historical stats is great, especially once you get into the season a little bit more. Again, the ability to sort by weeks, teams, positions, snap counts, everything else. Now the matchup charts. Wide receiver, cornerback. Why don't you walk us through this, Scott?
Yeah, so this is it might not be your most valuable tool. I mean, it might be, but it's definitely my favorite. It's what brought me to PFF like 5 years ago. So and this is extremely valuable for me playing DFS. I don't think that DraftKings or FanDuel really price cornerback matchups heavily into their salary projections. So this could be an edge for us. So if you click on the wide receiver versus cornerback matchup chart, it brings us back to the Super Bowl where Brandon Cooks was running the majority or the plurality of his routes against Ronald Darby. And it's just a way to look at where a wide receiver is going to run the highest percentage of their routes against which cornerback, although the advantage factors in all cornerbacks they're going to face. You could look at the height, weight, speed of the wide receiver and opposing cornerback. For some guys like Stephon Diggs, he really takes advantage of a big speed differential. Like if he's up against a slow cornerback, typically he's gonna spank him all game.
That's one of your favorite stats is speed differential, cornerback versus wide receiver. Yes.
Right. Yeah. That mattered a lot for Brandon Cooks when he was in New Orleans. The data suggests it matters quite a bit for Diggs, more so than any other wide receiver of the past decade, on a pretty decent sample.
Interesting.
But yeah, so you look at pre-snap position, so Brandon Cooks, 55% of his routes come from the left. Ronald Darby is in coverage on the opposite side for 91% of the routes. So it's safe to say Cooks is going to run at least half of his routes against Darby
without him even shadowing him. It's just this is how they line up all the time.
Exactly. And then we have the shadow matrix that includes so we see Alshon Jeffrey in all caps. That indicates a shadow, and our shadow matrix goes into this, and it shows which cornerbacks have been the best at shadowing, which wide receivers have beat shadow coverage before earlier in the season. But yeah, I like to look at yards per route run for the wide receiver versus yards per snap in coverage for the cornerback as a way to identify how good or bad the matchup is. The advantage does that too by grade. But yeah, this chart is huge for me. Definitely plays a big role for me in DFS each week.
And see, this is something that I try to get across to as many people as I can, because there's going to be people that look at this chart, even though this is just from the Super Bowl. When week one's matchups come out, you're going to see all of this for, how it matched up throughout 2017. And then as the year goes on, the more data that piles in, the more accurate that data is going to be for 2018. But people are going to see the column headers, right? L%, S%, R%, T/R, F/R, C%, Y/RR, and their eyes are going to go, I don't get this. I don't know it. All I know is that this guy is not good. And this guy can't. Don't you watch the game, son? So, guys, there is more to that than don't you watch the game, son. Right? So, yards per route run, very important stat. The percentage of the time that this wide receiver lines up on the left, the percentage of the time he lines up in the slot, the percentage of the time he lines up on the right. Same thing for the cornerback, where they line up, so you can see all the different things, right? Ronald Darby lines up 91% of the time on the right side of the field. He does play a side. He does not play a player. And he's let you know that if they're in all caps, that's somebody who's going to shadow. That's why you see him kind of all over the field, left, right, slot. So he's going to follow a receiver around. So once you learn how to read these charts, and it's not that hard to learn how to read them, it just takes a couple of seconds, and they've got a key right here to help you out with that. It really takes a whole lot of time out of your research process to be able to look at one of these charts and get along with it. Now, one that you do like is the offensive defensive line chart, the O-line, D-line, which is the same sort of thing. It's right up here on the same page. And again, we only have Philly versus New England right now posted on the site from the Super Bowl. But as we get through every week, why don't you talk to everybody a little bit about this one? I'll bring up the key so that they can see it.
Yeah, so on this chart, you'll see PR percentage. That's basically pressure percentage or pressure rate, pressures per dropback. And I know you've concluded the same thing based on your data, but for picking a fantasy defense each week, the best thing to look at is how often a defense gets pressures on a per dropback basis versus how often the opposing offense is surrendering pressures. Basically, it's really valuable to have a quarterback, flustered, constantly under pressure, getting sacked, throwing picks, losing fumbles.
That's how you
So
score
that's-
points in fantasy, right? It's like you on defense at least. You get points for sacks. Straightforward. You get points for fumbles. When you sack a quarterback, you have a good chance at a fumble. You also, when you pressure a quarterback, you have a chance for an errant throw, a rushed throw, or a weak throw to the outside that can get jumped for a pick six. If they create a fumble in the backfield, those can very much lead to a fat man touchdown, which should count more than a regular defensive score, but they don't. Something that I'm hoping DraftKings will fix in the future, the near future to come. But at least you get to cheer more for those as you watch the big fat man rumble down the field with nobody anywhere near him because he got that ball 10, 15 yards behind the line and was able to score an easy touchdown. So everything stems from pressure on defense, and this chart will help you find that out.
That's right. It's also important to note for your quarterback, if they have a really bad pressure rate matchup, maybe think twice about using them in DFS. And then for running backs, it's big too, that YBCO is yards before contact. So this chart where it says run, and then you'll see 40% in the green for Philadelphia. It contrasts yards before contact for the offense versus what the defense is surrendering. It's a good way to see if your running back has a good matchup on the ground.
All right. And then moving on to the position reports, right? So we've got premium stats. This is basically what PFF is pretty much known for, is their premium stats. This is an elite-only option, right? So if you have an elite sub, this is basically one of the main reasons why you have an elite sub, right? So we sorted by 2017. It defaults to 2018, which they don't have anything compiled yet because the season hasn't started. Where do you want to start here?
I mean, we could look at anything. Maybe since you're on quarterback, go to quarterback under pressure.
Got it.
And so we were just talking about pressure rate, right? How often a quarterback's under pressure.
And Russ Wilson with the most pressured dropbacks.
Yeah, obviously, constantly under fire. So if you want to click on NFL over there to the top right, you can look at which quarterbacks had the highest passer rating when under pressure, and yeah, so that's something to look at. More so for DFS purposes. If you want to go back, I like yards per route run quite a bit. I've written a ton of articles on why I think it's the greatest efficiency stat I've ever uncovered or I've ever tested. That's really big. Julio Jones just dominated in yards per route run last year, and he's dominated in yards per route run for pretty much every year of the past 5 years. What's curious about him is he actually doesn't really run a lot of routes, though. Atlanta is a little more run heavy, but also he kind of just plays like 88% of the snaps, maybe a little less, while DeAndre Hopkins is going to play like 96% of the snaps. He's going to run quite a bit more routes. I also like to look at, for running backs, elusive rating. That's a great metric for their ground game efficiency, or actually just total efficiency. It looks at missed tackles forced on both a per reception and per carry basis. It looks at yards after contact on the ground. So I think that's really big. And then for all the receivers, you can look at passer rating when targeted. You could look at how they performed in the slot, how often they were in the slot, how good they were on deep targets, their drop rate, pass blocking efficiency for running backs, and
let's go to receiving summary here, and let me click on wide receivers. This is
okay.
Get running backs out of there. So what column do you want me to sort by here? So it's got Julio Jones up top, and you can see his offensive, his receiving, his drop rate, his rating.
So those are the grades.
Yeah.
The colored blocks there. Those are the various grades. And then you could look at yards after catch per reception. That's YAC divided by rec.
Right.
You could look at drops, which is DRP. You could look at interceptions. That's an interesting thing to note. Like, if you want to sort by that, see who maybe you think this guy had a great year because of all these great counting stats. But if the quarterback wasn't very efficient, he threw a ton of his picks when targeting him. Maybe you should think twice. Maybe that's on him a little bit. He blew a route or what have you.
And the rating column?
That is passer rating when targeted.
Yep.
So that's another big one. How efficient were these quarterbacks when targeting? these various receivers.
And we can sort this by minimum, like let's say minimum of 50 targets. The guys who had the highest passer rating when targeted: Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyreek Hill, Ted Ginn Jr., Albert Wilson, Sammy Watkins. These are guys who theoretically made their quarterbacks look better when they threw them the ball, and usually it's going to come. That's why you have to set it with a minimum target, because the higher sample size guys, it's going to be tough for them when they get you get a guy like Tyreek Hill with 102, 108 for Devontae Adams, Marvin Jones at 105, Keenan Allen, the highest targeted guy, who's got the highest rating at 107 overall with 147 targets.
Right, and let's not forget, we can also look at these various stats for non-offensive positions or the offensive lines. We can look at defensive tackles, safeties, defensive ends, but cornerbacks, that's the thing I look at a ton. Just look at slot performance, look at their coverage, yards allowed per route and coverage. That's probably the big one for me.
So these are basically all the tools that you're going to need to do your own research to be better this football season. There is one bonus thing that I want to bring in because of the repeal of PASPA and a lot of states moving to legalize sports gambling. PFF does have a tool that they can use, and Scott's going to talk to you about how efficient they were last year against the spread. We're going to move on to their green line, which is also an elite. Is that elite or edge or both?
That's just elite, and that's our betting product, and we really crushed our bets last year. We did a lock of the week pick every week of last season, and we were a combined 24-8 on those, which is pretty incredible. If you have like a 55 to 60% win rate, that's considered super lucky, really good, or unsustainable. But what's really cool about this is you can look at what PFF thinks is going to happen in each game. We look at highly tested, data-backed predictions based on grades as well as other things. And I like to look at this, and I'm going to use our projected box scores over Vegas implied totals. I know people like that quite a bit, but it's the same reason why Dallas has failed to cover on Thanksgiving in each of the last 8 seasons. It's because Vegas knows all these Dallas fans are going to be eating turkey and want to put some money on their team. But that's not smart. They're not making predictions based on what they think is going to happen. It's what they think is going to happen plus how they think people are going to bet it. Whereas this is just raw. Here's what we think is going to happen, and based on what happened last year, we were very accurate with that. So I'm going to look at this.
How often do these get updated?
This gets updated live during the games. This is a phenomenal product, and it's brand new. It's only a few days old. But I've been having a lot of fun with it so far, and I feel really good about it.
I like the line move stuff, to be honest with you. That you're showing how on Friday at noon, on Saturday at noon, how the lines moved. It was -5, and then now it's -3.5. Here I'm looking at the Bengals and Colts for week 1. You can sort that column by the money line, the over/under. Totals is something that we talked about on a previous episode. If you haven't watched the episode that I did with Drew, we talked about how totals affect the quarterback's scorings more so than anything else. So if a game is trending upward in terms of points, quarterback efficiency is the greatest predictor of quarterback scoring. They don't need volume, but volume is great. Efficiency, if a guy, Aaron Rodgers had a game where he had like four touchdowns and 290 yards in the first half on like 12 throws. Right? So touchdowns gear most of the scoring. We can get a feel for if a game is expected to score a lot more points by how that line is moving versus the over/under. And this tool definitely has that for us as well.
That's right. And right under, spread history, you can look at what players are injured, the grade of those players, how significant that might be. But yeah, and we also have snaps per game from both sides. That's a pretty decent way to measure what Pat Thorman does in his article we were talking about before. But that's
the other thing. So like if the total affects the quarterback scoring, snaps affects running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, right? Because there's more plays, there's more chances for rushes, more chances for targets. Those things lead directly to scoring at the running back, tight end, and wide receiver position, as opposed to the total, which because of efficiency and scoring affects mostly the quarterback. So you get all of that within this, and it gets constantly updated throughout the week as the lines move. So Scott, thank you for joining me. Really appreciate it, guys. If you wanted to subscribe to PFF, I'll put a link in the description down below with the promo code MVP20 that you can use at checkout to get 20% off of an Edge or an Elite membership, whatever fits into your budget. Scott, thank you for joining me today. Guys, appreciate it. If you're still watching this video to this point, make sure you drop a like on this video. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that notifications bell. Leave me a comment in the comment section down below to let me know if there was something that helped you, that didn't, or if you have a question for Scott or any of the great guys over at PFF, and maybe I can get them to visit the comments and answer your questions as well. Thank you for being here. I'll catch you up to you for the next video next week. Bye, guys.